In part number 4 of the A-frame shelf build, I'll be covering final assembly, painting, and final finishing, as well as adding adjustable feet. One thing I never covered in the last video was how I was going to attach the shelf supports to the A-frame. So what you can see here in this picture is that I will be gluing and screwing the shelf supports into the A-frame. I've made some knife marks on the A-frames, so I know the exact location of where these shelf supports are going to go. I put them in place and counterbore and countersink the holes through the shelf supports into the A-frame, and that will help me locate them during final assembly. This photo here was taken before I cut the front of the shelf supports flush with the A-frame, and here you can see the counterbore and countersink going through the shelf support. This will later get plugged. Here you can see I had to mask off all the grooves so paint wouldn't get into the groove where the walnut panel has to sit, which was a lot of fun. Not really. Assembly of the A-frame shelves. Started off on the wrong foot. Here I'm just realizing that I'm putting the wrong shelf support against the wrong A-frame. And there's the right one. The assembly process starts by inserting some screws through the shelf supports and just having them slightly protrude through the outer surface so then they can be located on the A-frames. I then apply some glue to both the A-frame and the shelf support before permanently attaching the shelf support to the A-frame using the 2 screws previously driven in there, and I finished up by hand tightening them. Here's a little bit better view that I'm not blocking, but you can see, get the screws started, make sure they align properly. Gonna apply some glue, spread it around, make a nice thin coat so I don't have to clean up as much squeeze out. Then reassemble the shelf support, drive them down using an electric screwdriver, and then I finish torquing them using a hand screwdriver to make sure I don't strip anything out. And then continue that process up the A-frame. I should also mention that all the components were sanded up to 150 grit before I got to this assembly process. I just skipped all that video since it's pretty boring. The other side of the shelf support and A-frame are attached the same way, just this time I apply glue to all the shelf supports at the same time and work my way up the A-frame, screwing things together. After getting the shelves screwed and glued together, I came back with glue and some plugs that I previously cut and put a liberal amount of glue in the hole and on the plug, pounded the plug in, and here I am coming back afterwards and flushing it up. First using a flush trim saw, and then a chisel, and then finally 220 grit sandpaper. After all the assembly was done, it was time to move on to paint. Um, the paint color I chose was this Glidden color called Western Charcoal. It's very similar to a lot of the dark browns slash black brown colors that are out in the market today, and also matches a lot of our existing furniture. So that's why it's getting painted, is so it's more cohesive with what we already have in our house. I'm painting the shelves with a paintbrush and roller. Not an ideal solution by any means. I think next time if I want to do a latex paint job, I'm gonna buy a sprayer and give that a shot. I got the process down. This is I'm on the second one at this point in time. You can see it's up on the bench. I do the lower portion and the upper portion while it's up on the bench. I then will put it down the floor on its feet and work my way up and down the shelf, covering everything. Everything received at least 2 coats of paint. In between the first and second coat, I would use a razor blade to cut off any small drips or sags I had, and then use 220 grit sandpaper to smooth that out. Here I'm putting a third coat on some areas that still are not completely covered. Maybe a hint of wood or kind of a green hue was still coming through that had to be touched up. So using a bright light and a paintbrush to hit those. Alright, after the paint was all dry, it was now time to peel out the masking inside the grooves of the shelf supports. This was kind of a tricky process. The masking tape wouldn't come out cleanly, leave a little bit of a rough edge, so I worked my way around the shelf support, pulling out the masking tape. I would then try to clean up any of the paint that got into the groove with the utility knife. I then came back later with a very thin block with some sandpaper around it and sanded down the inside edges just to make sure there's no paint in that groove when the walnut panel went in there. So once all the masking tape was pulled off and I was ready to apply a top coat, I moved on to the walnut panels and had to apply some shellac to them. I applied 2 coats, did a sanding to get the gloss off with 320 grit, and then it was ready to start spraying them. I'm using some water-based lacquer. I think it's Target Coatings M-Tech 6000 maybe, but it sprays really well without having to thin it. Here I'm spraying the walnut panels, spraying the one side, and then I'll leave them sit for about 20 minutes, come back out, flip them over, spray the other side. The second coat I figured out a little bit better process. I'd actually bring them over to this black stool that I have sitting in the middle of the garage, spray them, move them back to their respective location, bring a new one over. That just helped me get all 4 edges as well as the top and bottom surface. All of the walnut panels received 2 coats of this lacquer. Now moving on to the A-frame shelves themselves. After the latex was fully dried, after about 2 or 3 days, I came out and sprayed 2 coats of the same water-based lacquer all over the shelves. You can see in the background what my quote-unquote spray booth looks like. It's essentially a lot of plastic, some cardboard boxes, and then I have a box fan over in the corner exhausting the fumes and the air outside the garage. And since my finishes are all water-based, the fumes aren't terrible at all. They usually clear up within maybe 5 minutes out in the garage. After the finish cured, I wanted to add some adjustable feet to the bottom of the shelf, but a lot of the store-bought ones are very large. They use quarter-inch bolts. The tap-in or pound-in threaded adapters are very large, and I was worried they would end up cracking the legs on the A-frames. So what I did is I decided to make my own. I bought some number 10 by 32 brass inserts, as well as some number 10 all thread. The inserts are drilled and then threaded into the bottom of the legs here, and I make the leveling feet are simple nuts that are epoxied into these wood blocks. You can see they screw in there, and you can unscrew them or screw them in, adjust the height, whatever. Here I'm screwing on a lot of the nuts onto this all thread, because once I cut the all thread, the actual threads get a little mangled, so I have to wind the nut over that thread to fix it. And so I just put the all thread in my drill, hold on to a nut, and run it down. Here I'm cutting the all thread to length. I'm just marking it out with a pencil, and then I'm using a Dremel with a cutoff wheel just to cut them to size. I didn't record how I made the blocks, but they started off as squares. I then drilled a shallow hole in the center with a Forstner bit that would allow me to pound a nut into it and for it to seat tightly. I then rounded off the blocks so they're more circular in shape, and here I'm putting epoxy into those holes, pounding the nut in, and then inserting the all thread so that's all epoxied together. I'm also applying some felt to the bottom side of the block with epoxy. Here I am pounding the nut in on my workbench. After the threaded leveling feet were done, I installed the walnut shelves into their grooves, and I drilled a very small pilot hole in the bottom of the shelf through an elongated hole that would hold those shelves into place. I didn't record this, but here's some finished photos of what the shelves look like. You can see the walnut panels. If I were to make this again, I would make the entire shelf support and the shelf from walnut all finished with oil. That would make the transition from paint to the oil finish a little more clean, less masking involved. Here's the shelf in its new home in our house, outfitted with baskets and ornaments and books and whatever else. Thanks for watching.